I'm a little late to the party with these ones. However, the last lot of the Soulblight Gravelords new releases hit the market a couple of weeks back, and I've been working on them to get them ready to join the rest of my army. And well, that's what we're going to touch on in this video. Specifically, I'm going to look firstly at the faction terrain, the Cursed Sepulchre. But first, hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Wayne. As I said, we're going to look at the Cursed Sepulchre. Now, I was originally going to paint this alongside the old terrain, the Sigmarite Mausoleum, which was a repackaged Warhammer Fantasy kit from way back in the day. However, I'm going to tackle that in a separate video. The reason being, even though they are very similar, there's obviously utility involved in having your faction terrain, and so I wanted it to stand out. Not only because I thought it would look a little bit better, I wanted to give it a spookier, more ethereal feel to it, but also thinking about anybody that I'm playing against, I wanted it to make it blatantly obvious which bits of terrain, if I was using the Sigmarite Mausoleum and the Cursed Sepulchre, which was which. So just being a little bit more conscious of the people I'm playing with. I know you can paint for advantage, but that is absolutely something not what I would do. So yeah. Okay then, how are we going to paint it? Well, I'm glad you asked, but before we get into that, if you've not already, leave me a comment, like, and subscribe. I've noticed there's been significantly less views on the last few videos, and that's not a problem. I'm not too fussed about that at all. I'm not doing this for views, but if you could give it a like, just so that the algorithm boosts it up, that would be really useful. Obviously, longer term, once I've got past this army and the next army, it'd be nice to get a little bit more interaction with people and just find out what people want. And if there's more people there to have that conversation with, the better. Right. Anyway, enough of that stuff. Let's get into painting this, I suppose. Yeah, let's do that. Let's get his teeth sunk in. Fangs a lot. Sorry. Oh, my days. Come on, let's do it. I'm just going to stop apologizing for those bad jokes. I can't help it. There's probably going to be some more as we take a bite out of this project. Let's crack on. In the first instance, I've primed the entire model black. After building it into a couple of sub-assemblies, I've not attached any of the mausoleum parts to the bases, just so that I can take them off and paint them more easily. And I've done the same with any interior details like these crypts. I may come back later and put some lighting effects in them. That's why I've done this, and it just makes it a little bit easier. Once I did that, I hit them all from the top down with a white spray paint. That's going to give me a really good idea of what the model is going to look like and where I need to be focusing my attention. Now, the next part that I did is come in with the airbrush to pick out some details, just so that I can use the contrast of them later. You can do this with white paint if you want, but I'm going to be using an airbrush where possible because it makes life easier and faster, and that'll lay the foundations for where we're going to put some of the contrast paints later on, speed paints, whatever, thin down acrylics or inks. You could even do it with oil washes, but I'm just really going to bang through this project and get to a really good, decent, solid tabletop standard as fast as I can. You could, if you wanted, go full slap chop with this as well. Just dry brush the entire thing in white and then just put on any speed paints, contrasts, anything like that, and you'd still get a really, really good result. This kit's actually really well detailed, and it does lend itself to that fast slap chop style of technique. However, you probably know me by now, I do like to go a little bit further, and it's somewhere between the slap chop and a really decent tabletop standard that I like to land. So I'm just going to spend a little bit more time with the airbrush, laying the foundations for where I want the light sources to be, where I might want any areas of interest, but also areas of shadow as well, because it's that shadow, as we've talked about in many previous videos, that gives us the contrast, and it's the contrast that gives the look that I really like and the one that I'm trying to achieve. With that in mind, I'm going to work my way around the model and just pick out any elements that do give me some interest, but also looking where I can take advantage of those darker points on the model, the shadows, and make sure that I avoid putting any paint there. Now that the prep's all out of the way, I'm going to come in with one of my favourite colours, Vallejo Game Colour Stonewall Grey. It's a lovely warm grey colour, and this we're going to dry brush over the entire model. I'm using a big old round dry brush for this, slightly moistened tips. Remember, just because it's called dry brush, you do want some moisture on there so that the paint doesn't end up getting all chalky and flaky. And well, there's no way of really skipping past this. It's just going to take a little bit of time, but not too much. Work slowly. It's much easier to add paint than it is to take anything off. And I'm just going to try and hit all of the corners. That's certainly the technique that I'm going to take when I'm tackling the base. When I go for the actual Sepulchre in a moment, you'll see I'm just doing top down. But do try and hit every stone at least. It's a sad fact that a lot of us do sometimes just gloss over the whole side of terrain painting because it's not as much fun or as interesting as painting his actual army. Well, yeah, you are right. But I do find that some of these sculpts are absolutely amazing and they're really fun to paint. And to be honest, it's really fast to get a decent looking standard without putting much effort in. And it really does help bring something to the gaming table, in my opinion at least. When it comes to the sepulchral structures themselves, we want to take a little bit more time, and I'm primarily working top down. So as a general rule, starting at the top of the model and working my way down, applying more pressure and more paint to the top of the model. Again, this is going to help give us a nice gradation from light to dark, and that's going to help lay the foundations for putting the paints on later on, be that by a brush or airbrush, spray can, whatever method you prefer. I'm going to go straight onto the roof then, and I'm going to use this Vallejo Game colour Brassy Brass. This is quite a thin paint, and I would normally use it over something like a light red just to give it a little bit more warmth. But in this case, since we're going to weather it later on, I'm not going to bother too much about that. I just want to make sure I hit all of the panels and get a reasonably even coat over the roof and any other elements that we want to read as this colour later on. Bear in mind, this will be heavily weathered and give us that bleak verdigris look later on. So don't go too heavy on it all over. Using some contrasts over the zenithal that we've already established and the dry brushing is really going to help us pick out some of the details like the bones and the branches, any sort of vegetation on there. This is really straightforward and nice and easy. When I'm applying contrast, I do tend to use a very damp, almost bordering on wet brush. I find this helps me get the paint from the brush, but also desaturates them in an interesting way that it gives me a nice uneven finish. You don't want to do it so wet that the paint actually loses its properties, its contrasting ability. But what you do want to do is make sure that you're not putting things on oversaturated and the colours just looking like blocks of each individual colour. You want them to naturally play with each other. That's how colours in the real world work. There is some interplay between them. This helps replicate that, I find. It is at this point where it just takes a little bit of time working through each of the details. I start with the largest areas of colour first, and then I work down to the more detailed elements. In this case, the vines, the skulls, the leaves, any of the roses that I want to pick out. I just sit back, put on a podcast, and work my way through them. Working with nice thin paints still. Even those contrasts, I am still thinning them down using that very moist brush, like I say, and that really lets the underpainting that we've already done shine through like a little bit more of a posher slap chop, as it were. Probably noticing at this point I am being a little bit more careful with how I'm applying the paint, just because I don't want to go over onto any of that grey. That will cause problems later on, especially in the next step. Do take your time here. There's no rush, is there? And this is quite a cathartic process. It's not like there's huge amounts of it to do, so it can be quite chill. But especially with the darker colours, do try and be as neat as possible and avoid any of the wall segments. And speaking of those wall segments, let's do something to make them a little bit more interesting. I'm just going to use a contrast paint thinned down just to glaze over some of the wall segments on the sepulchres. It doesn't really matter what colour you're going to use. I chose a bone colour. Could absolutely use something brighter if you want to go for an extra pop of colour, perhaps your accent colour for your own army. I like the more subdued tone that I'm going to get with this, especially over the top of the established work that we've already done. So it'll read again brighter at the top, darker at the bottom, and just give us a nice, more natural look to it. This warm sepia gives it somewhat of an aged look, almost like it was rendered at one point in time and it's kind of flaked away. It just brings out a little bit of the detail underneath the vines without going too far. We want it to mostly read as grey, but we can also use this to bring out other elements of interest that we want, should we want to. So I'm using exactly the same colour. Things are on the candlesticks. around the door, any kind of little flourishes that you might want to draw attention to. Remember, I am using a very moist brush here, so it's going on super thin. It's almost glaze-like, just a hint of colour, and it gives us a little bit more interest without adding any real additional work. You're pretty much just wetting the surface of what we've already painted here. And obviously where it goes into the recesses, it'll darken those down, again, giving us that contrast that we want at no extra effort at all on our part. Now, one of the final elements I'm going to do here is come in with a light brown, a beigey colour. You could even mix a little bit of white into your contrast you used earlier, and I'm going to polish the tree bark anywhere where I use this dark brown, so on the vines as well, but just at the top. With the tree, I am going to dry brush it all over just so that some of those details stand out, but not too heavily. I am going to knock this back later as well with a final step, so don't worry if you go too far with it, but that will require you having an airbrush or coming back in with a black dry brush, so try not to go too OTT, but I want the brown to read a little bit more browny and rich, if that makes sense. Just work your way slowly around it, not too heavy again, and just think of polishing the bark rather than really going aggressively. I know it does look like I'm going quite hard here, but there's hardly any paint at all on the brush. We can get 2 for 1 here, so I'm going to use the remaining paint that's on the brush to just lightly dust the top of the vines as well. Nothing too fancy here. You don't have to reload your brush with anything, just use the remainder of the paint on from the tree. Nice and easy, job done. Let's sort that roof then. Right, I'm going to use Dirty Down's Verdigris effect. Now, if you've not used this before, definitely make sure you shake the bottle. When you've shook it, shake it some more because you've not shooken it enough. Then when you think you're done, shake it again a little bit longer and you should be somewhere close to it. Make sure your model is warm, so don't do it in a cold room, and also make sure the verdigris is warm. Again, I use this on a moist brush. It gives a better effect that I find, and you can come in later again with some more water and apply it in multiple layers to reactivate it. But this can be a difficult one. It's a very odd consistency of paint to work with. But what you do want to do is get it all over your areas that you want to have weathering on them, that you want to be verdigrid. And you can either wipe it off later or come back in and work it after the fact with the moist brush. I prefer the latter technique, but it's entirely up to you. You're going to need to leave it about 15 to 20 minutes for the effect to completely come out. And then, yeah, it's totally transformed, to be honest. It goes from shiny to 100 years old in a few minutes. Absolutely cracking stuff, this. But I'm not sure I actually like it. Let me know if you want me to talk more about that one, and I absolutely will do. In fact, while we'll be watching this, do, if you're enjoying this, give me a comment, like, and subscribe. Don't forget, it does help the channel grow. Thank you very much. And here we go. Once it's dry, it does look really, really good. I could have applied it better, and to be honest, I didn't come back in and do multiple layers like I normally would, but I think for what I want, it actually looks okay. You could use a rag and wipe it off at this point if you wanted to polish it a little bit more, but I'm actually going to come in with a light dry brush of gunmetal just to simulate where there might be some wear on the metal elements, so where the verdigris might have naturally rubbed off as things have rubbed against it. Any sort of light gunmetal or a dark silver will do for this, or you can completely skip it. It's entirely up to you. I just thought it added an extra little something to it, and I didn't like to skimp just because it's terrain. For the most part, that's it. We're just going to get in with the final details now, and this is purely something that I do for my armies. I like a little bit of OSL, so I'm going to pick out a couple of elements on the models to be the spooky parts that are glowing. Obviously, the skeleton's going to be one of them. Pardon my head getting in the way here. So all I'm going to do is use some white ink, and I'm going to start to lay in where I want the brightest points of light to be. If you've watched any of the other Soulblight videos in this series, link up there in the top corner, then you will have seen me already do this on some of the other models. I'm going to use some white ink to create the hottest spots, and then I'm going to come back in with that ethereal blue glow that is going to be the signature element that contrasts all of the reds. We're using that blue glow to bring it out very sparingly in this Soulblight army. Using the airbrush, I'm just going to establish a halo effect and give some vibrantly to the flames. Again, I want these to be reading as that blue color that we've just established on the skeleton, and I don't mind a little bit of overspray here because it's going to give us that light casting effect on the rest of the model. For that glowing blue effect, I'm going to use Green Stuff World's fluorescent blue as the dark blue, and then I'm going to use contrast paint achromatic blue. I'm not going to cover this in explicit detail as I've already done a video on this in the Soulblight playlist, so do check that one out. But in short, all I do is I flip-flop between achromatic blue and white a couple of times, just getting less and less coverage with the blue until eventually I'm glazing, and that gives us a nice glowing effect. And once that's out of the way, we're pretty much done. The only thing I'm going to do is vignette the base, again with the airbrush and a little bit of black paint, and that's just going to give us the dark ground colour and the contrast, and let's have a look what we ended up with. There you are. That was super simple, wasn't it? There was nothing really hard there. I think we've pretty much covered all of these techniques before. And obviously, if you've not seen the previous videos, the Soulblight ones, go and have a look at those. This kind of leans heavily into that cursed city kind of vibe that I was creating with the first lot of Soulblight, and what is the overarching narrative of my army. Have you painted these? If you have, what did you think of them? Do you like the models as much as I do? And let me see some of your stuff. Send me links down below. Get in touch with me. I would love to see how you've painted your terrain. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for joining me. I hope you had fun with this one, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.